The church bells tolled across the small town cemetery, their hollow sound cutting through the damp afternoon air. Rows of mourners stood in silence, faces hidden under umbrellas, while rain dripped from the edges and splattered against the fresh earth. My brother's coffin lay just a few feet away from me, polished wood already stained with droplets, and my chest ached with the weight of finality. I clenched my jaw, refusing to let the tears fall, when suddenly I felt a vibration in my pocket. My hand trembled as I pulled out my phone, the screen glowing against the gray sky. A private number, a single message, 3 words that ripped through me harder than grief ever could. I'm alive. My knees almost gave way, my vision blurred with a heat I could barely contain, and rage rose like fire inside me. If my brother was alive, then who was in that coffin? Who were we burying in front of this town? And why, in the same breath, would he tell me not to trust our parents? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I stood frozen in that moment, staring at the glowing words on my phone, and the world around me faded into a blur of umbrellas and whispers. The coffin was still being lowered, ropes creaking as polished wood descended into the ground, but my thoughts were locked on that single question tearing at me from the inside. If Jacob Miller was alive, then who was this town grieving for? My brother had vanished months ago, and our parents had been the ones to tell me he was gone forever, taken by a sudden accident that never quite made sense. Now I had to ask myself why he would fake his death, why he would reach out to me of all people on the very day of his own funeral, and why his warning was aimed at the 2 people standing only a few feet away, holding their heads high as if they were carrying no secrets at all. What were they hiding? Who had we really buried? And if Jacob's message was true, then who could I trust? My name is Ethan Miller, 38 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have lived in the same small town where every secret eventually makes its way into the open, except the ones guarded by blood. I have worked most of my life as a mechanic, a trade that keeps my hands calloused and my back bent, but it is honest work that kept me grounded even when everything else in my family was fractured. My younger brother, Jacob Miller, was the opposite in almost every way. At 35, he had always been restless, quick to chase trouble, and never content with the life we were born into. He disappeared months before the funeral, and while our parents told everyone it was tragedy that stole him away, in my gut I knew something was wrong. They were strict, unyielding, and carried themselves as if their word was final, but behind that firmness was a coldness that left scars deeper than anything a belt or a harsh word could manage. Our home was built on discipline, silence, and expectations that felt more like chains than guidance. Jacob and I were close once, tied together by the bond only brothers understand, but even in our best moments there were cracks forming. I still remember us playing in the yard, daring each other to climb higher, run faster, laugh louder, only to return inside to the piercing eyes of parents who reminded us that joy was fleeting and obedience was forever. Over the years, favoritism crept in, small gestures that grew into larger divides. Jacob often accused me of being the loyal son, while he was treated as the mistake, and I resented him for it. Our parents spoke often of inheritance, of property and money, dangling the future like bait while keeping us fighting over scraps of approval. Those seeds of betrayal sank into the soil of our lives, watered by every argument and every silent dinner, until they grew into something neither Jacob nor I could control. But none of us knew then. Jacob had been planning something far darker. It was in the early weeks of spring when our parents announced that Jacob Miller had died in what they called a sudden accident. No details were given, no police officer came to my door, and no explanation followed beyond a vague story that he had been found lifeless after a night out of town. They stood firm in their words, delivering the news with voices steady, but eyes colder than the ground we were supposed to bury him in. I remember asking for answers, begging for something more than the hollow explanations they offered. But my questions were brushed aside as if curiosity itself was a betrayal. The funeral was scheduled almost immediately, with paperwork pushed through faster than I had ever seen in our county. When I asked to see Jacob's body, Our parents insisted the casket must remain closed, telling me it was better to remember him as he was. But their calmness felt staged, as though they were reciting lines rehearsed long before the news reached me. The town whispered in corners and behind closed doors. Some said Jacob had taken his own life, others suggested he had staged the whole thing to escape debts, and still others whispered that our parents were hiding the truth of what really happened. Each rumor only deepened the cracks in my trust. Why had the authorities been so absent? Why had no report been shown to me? And why did our parents move with such quiet efficiency, as though they were more concerned with appearances than with grief? The coffin, polished and sealed, became a symbol not of closure, but of deception, an unanswered question dressed in flowers and tradition. And as the mourners gathered around the grave just as the coffin was being lowered into the earth, my phone lit up with the truth. The moment the funeral ended, I knew I could not let Jacob Miller's message rest without answers. I began to retrace his steps quietly, keeping my investigation hidden from our parents, who seemed more intent on silencing questions than on mourning. Late nights in the garage turned into hours spent poring over phone records, and it wasn't long before I stumbled onto something strange. Multiple burner phones linked to Jacob, each purchased under cash accounts and discarded after only a few calls. I pressed further, visiting the local bank where an old friend revealed a string of withdrawals from Jacob's account in the weeks leading up to his supposed death. The sums weren't enormous, but they were consistent, and the dates aligned with times when our parents claimed he had been missing. The more I uncovered, the more I felt that Jacob had been moving pieces on a board none of us even realized existed. When I confronted our parents with questions, their response was sharp and cold. My mother's eyes hardened as she told me to stop digging, while my father's voice carried a weight of finality as he warned me to let it go. Their defensiveness only deepened my suspicion, and whispers around town began to fuel my doubts. Some claimed Jacob had been drowning in debt, others muttered about an affair that had driven him into hiding, while a darker rumor suggested he had been caught in something criminal. Each false lead twisted the truth further out of reach, and yet every clue pulled me closer to a reality I was not prepared for. I pushed on, combing through scraps of evidence, newspaper clippings, and fragments of conversations, until one night I uncovered something my parents never wanted me to see, and it changed everything. The discovery came late one night when I traced the number that had sent the message during Jacob Miller's funeral. Against all odds, the signal led me to a remote area outside town, a place Jacob and I had visited as children when we wanted to escape the suffocating rules of our parents. My pulse hammered as I approached the cabin, and when the door finally creaked open, there he was. Jacob, alive, his face thinner, eyes hollow, but his voice steady. He confessed that he had staged his own disappearance not because he wanted to hurt me, but because he had stumbled onto something so dangerous that he believed he had no choice but to vanish. Our parents, he said, were not grieving at all. They had orchestrated the funeral as a cover, a performance to bury questions that might expose years of embezzlement, stolen inheritance, and deals too corrupt to survive the light of day. The coffin was not closure. It was a shield for their lies. Jacob's words burned through me, leaving my loyalty split in two. On one side was the brother I thought I had lost, now asking for trust in a secret life that made little sense. On the other side stood our parents, cold and calculating, but still the figures who had raised me and held control over everything we had known. Jacob admitted he had been withdrawing money in secret, not to escape debts or scandal as the town believed, but to gather proof of what our parents had done. He said he wanted me to join him, to stand against them, but every syllable pressed me deeper into a conflict I was not ready to face. The anger that had filled me at the funeral now tangled with confusion, guilt, and fear. And just when I thought I had the answers, the truth struck harder than ever. When Jacob Miller finally laid out the full story, the ground beneath my life gave way. The coffin we buried that rainy afternoon had never contained Jacob at all. It held the body of someone else entirely, a man tied to the hidden dealings of our parents. That stranger was connected to decades of fraud and deception, a tangled web of illegal adoption papers and stolen wealth that our parents had built their authority upon. The funeral had been staged not only to erase Jacob from the picture, but also to disguise the end of a man who knew too much about their crimes. As the weight of the revelation settled on me, I realized that the house I grew up in, the values I was taught, even the love I believed we shared, had all been constructed on lies. My parents had not just betrayed me or Jacob. They had shaped our entire lives from the foundation of deceit. I wanted answers. I wanted confrontation. But by the time I returned to the cabin the next evening, Jacob was gone. No trace, no note, only silence left behind like a shadow. He had vanished again, leaving me with nothing but his warning and the hollow echo of the truth. I stood in the cemetery days later, staring at the grave that bore his name but not his body, the flowers wilting, the stone already gathering dust, and I understood something that would stay with me forever. Sometimes the dead aren't the ones who haunt us, it's the living who carry the darkest secrets. As I stood there with the truth burning inside me, torn between the memory of Jacob Miller's words and the chilling certainty of what our parents had done, I knew this story was no longer mine alone. It was a question that reached beyond the grave, a test of loyalty and trust that any of us could face. If you were in my place, standing at your brother's funeral with a message in your hand, telling you he was alive and warning you not to trust the very people who raised you, what would you have done? Would you believe the message, cling to the hope that your brother was still out there, or would you side with the parents who shaped your life, no matter how cold their secrets felt? The choice is not as simple as it seems, and it is one that still haunts me to this day. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear about the man who walked into his own funeral, smiling, alive, and ready to reveal the kind of truth no one could have imagined. That is a story you will not want to miss. So, subscribe for more real-life stories with twists you'll never forget, because what you just heard is only the beginning.